Winter 1943. Inside a secret British compound, one man dared to answer an impossible question. Could electronics defeat Hitler before mathematics even had a chance? Britain's cryptographers were drowning in intercepted Nazi transmissions. Not the standard Enigma traffic they'd grown accustomed to cracking, but an entirely different beast. The Lorenz SZ4042 cipher apparatus, reserved exclusively for communications between the Führer and his top generals across the European theater. This encryption system generated complexity on a scale that defied human comprehension. Individual transmissions contained tens of thousands of symbols, each scrambled through 12 rotating components, creating trillions upon trillions of potential configurations. Decoding by hand at operational tempo was simply unthinkable. Within the walls of Bletchley Park, brilliant minds like Bill Tutte and Max Newman had accomplished something remarkable. They'd reverse-engineered the Lorenz mechanism's architecture without physical access to an actual device. Yet understanding the enemy's method solved only half the equation. What Britain desperately required was automated processing capability, a system that could scan, cross-reference, and evaluate countless millions of symbol sequences within seconds. That problem landed on the desk of Tommy Flowers, chief engineer at the General Post Office facility in Dollishill, northwest London. Flowers came from outside the traditional circles of military and scholarly prestige. His expertise centered on telecommunications infrastructure, building dependable rapid switching networks for the nation's telephone grid. What distinguished him from his peers was unwavering faith in thermionic valve technology, vacuum tube components that conventional wisdom dismissed as inherently unstable for large-scale applications. When Newman reached out to postal authorities seeking technical assistance, Flowers recognized possibility where others saw limitation. He envisioned attacking the Lorenz problem through purely electronic means. Rather than depending upon mechanical relays or spinning drum mechanisms, an all-electronic architecture could operate without pause at the velocity of electricity itself, cross-checking cipher streams against key sequences exponentially faster than any mechanical alternative could manage. In early 1943, proposing a computational device containing thousands of vacuum tubes seemed like fantasy. Prevailing engineering opinion held that such tubes would burn out within mere hours of continuous operation. Even telecommunications exchanges typically employed only dozens simultaneously. Flowers advocated for deploying over 2,500. When he pitched this concept to colleagues and to the government code and cipher school headquarters, skepticism ruled the room. Official funding was rejected outright. Instead of accepting defeat, Flowers chose self-sufficiency, utilizing postal service supplies, surplus valve inventory, and pure determination. Assembling a compact team at Dollishill, he commenced engineering what history would eventually call Colossus, humanity's inaugural large-scale electronic calculating machine. Every connection, every component, every pathway required original design. No instruction manuals existed, no precedents to follow. Flowers merged his telecommunications background with pioneering logic architecture principles to manage data at unprecedented velocities. The machine's foundation relied on photoelectric tape scanning technology. Intercepted Lorenz traffic got punched onto continuous paper strips, which the apparatus would read at approximately 5,000 symbols each second. That information would undergo electronic comparison with algorithmically generated key configurations from simulated wheel positions, hunting for the statistically optimal correlation. Each successful alignment could reveal the probable internal configuration of the Lorenz unit that encrypted that specific message. By substituting mechanical movement with electrical impulses, Flowers intended to eliminate the physical constraints plaguing earlier decryption equipment like Heath Robinson, constructed under Newman's direction. That predecessor system employed synchronized paper tape mechanisms and suffered constant malfunctions from slippage and friction degradation. For Flowers, those failures proved that only electronics offered sufficient precision. His work proceeded largely in isolation. Officially, postal authorities lacked authorization to construct such equipment for intelligence purposes, and his supervisors expressed concern about resource scarcity during total war. Nevertheless, by December 1943, the prototype blueprint was complete. Flowers had privately funded substantial portions of the initiative, investing hundreds of pounds from personal savings, considerable wealth by wartime standards, driven purely by conviction in the concept's validity. The prototype, subsequently designated Colossus Mark I, underwent assembly at Dollis Hill before clandestine transport to Bletchley Park throughout January 1944. Installation consumed multiple weeks, requiring hundreds of cable runs, frameworks of luminous valves, and microsecond precision reading apparatus. The complete system filled a modest room and demanded dedicated electrical supply. Yet upon activation, it accomplished what experts had deemed impossible. Electronic velocity married to logical reasoning. When the apparatus first processed intercepted Lorenz cipher material, completion time dropped from weeks to minutes. For the initial time in the conflict, analysts obtained virtually instantaneous intelligence regarding German Supreme Command communications. Strategic planners could predict enemy movements weeks before the enemy moved. Flowers had achieved both technological and tactical breakthrough, but inside Bletchley Park, his accomplishments stayed classified and essentially unrecognized. Official documentation attributed success to the cryptanalysts' theoretical insights, barely acknowledging the engineering foundation beneath the system. The classification surrounding Colossus meant that even throughout Britain's scientific establishment, hardly anyone knew a functioning electronic computer existed before Armistice. What Flowers had constructed transcended simple code-breaking apparatus. It represented an entirely new category of machine. It accepted configuration through switch settings and cable connections to execute varied logical procedures. It consumed input autonomously, handled information electronically, and delivered output to teleprinter devices. Fundamentally, it was a programmable digital calculator constructed a complete 2 years ahead of any comparable system worldwide. Colossus's existence would remain among Britain's most zealously protected wartime secrets for generations. The majority of units were destroyed post-1945, and surviving examples were disassembled or concealed. When popular computing histories began circulating during the 1950s, names like Alan Turing, John von Neumann, and Konrad Zuse dominated narratives. Tommy Flowers's contribution went unmentioned. What almost nobody beyond government channels understood was that in 1943, a postal engineer had already crossed the threshold into the electronic era. His apparatus silently transformed warfare into computational territory. That opening question, whether machinery could outthink humans, had received its answer. But virtually nobody knew it yet. Throughout the months preceding D-Day, British intelligence wielded a novel advantage, one incapable of firing ammunition or delivering explosives. It processed data. At this advantage's core stood Colossus, the electronic system engineered by Tommy Flowers. Within half a year of deployment, it had converted Bletchley's most challenging cryptanalysis assignment into automated routine. The inaugural version, Colossus Mark I, became operational by January 1944. It utilized 1,500 vacuum tubes, scanned paper tape at 5,000 symbols per second, and compared intercepted cipher material against thousands of electronically generated key configurations. Results printed for cryptanalyst review, enabling reconstruction of original Lorenz parameters. Tasks previously requiring weeks by manual methods now completed within hours. 4 Allied intelligence networks. This created near-instantaneous visibility into high-level German command traffic. Lorenz transmissions carried information flowing directly between Hitler's operation staff, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, and theater commanders throughout occupied territories. They exposed movements of complete divisions, logistics networks, and defensive preparations. Each successful Colossus analysis generated intelligence, codenamed Ultra, distributed to senior Allied strategists, including Operation Overlord planners preparing the Normandy assault. The improvement proved so dramatic that British authorities immediately commissioned a second unit. This enhanced model, designed once more by Flowers and his Dollis Hill personnel, would operate faster, larger, and with greater adaptability. Colossus Mark II. It would house over 2,400 vacuum tubes and provide capability to electronically replicate Lorenz's 12-wheel system, permitting cryptanalysts to evaluate far broader parameter ranges in compressed time frames. By May 1944, Mark II stood ready. The upgraded apparatus reached Bletchley Park mere weeks before D-Day. Its contribution proved decisive. On June 5, 1944, a decrypted Lorenz transmission verified that Hitler anticipated Allied landings at Pas-de-Calais instead of Normandy. This intelligence fragment strengthened the deception campaign designated Operation Fortitude, guaranteeing German divisions remained positioned distant from the genuine invasion beaches. Normandy's success owed partial credit to that singular confirmation, generated by Flowers's creation. Inside Bletchley, however, Flowers's achievement escaped celebration. The operational environment maintained strict compartmentalization. Engineers seldom encountered cryptanalysts, and few beyond the immediate working group even grasped the machine's functionality. For most personnel, Colossus represented just another classified instrument. Despite secrecy, performance spoke volumes. Each Colossus operated almost constantly, processing thousands of intercepted Lorenz messages. Operators loaded endless spools of punch paper tape, each bearing raw radio intercepts, gathered by British monitoring stations. The valve reliability, previously the paramount concern, emerged as among the system's greatest strengths. Flowers had insisted vacuum tubes would maintain stability under continuous power, and events proved him correct. Practically speaking, failures occurred rarely. The machines operated for months, without significant breakdowns. In wartime Britain, where replacement parts were rationed and every asset stretched thin, this dependability was extraordinary. While Colossus units functioned at Bletchley, Flowers stayed at Dollis Hill, supervising production of additional machines. 10 Colossi were ultimately constructed before war's conclusion. Each successive iteration refined the architecture, accelerated logic circuitry, enhanced statistical analysis, and improved reconfiguration ease. Effectively, they were evolving into programmable platforms. The technology raised delicate questions within British command, however. How much should exist, and who deserved knowledge of it? The Colossus initiative carried maximum classification. Even among Allied powers, design information remained restricted. The United States was developing electromechanical cryptanalysis equipment through the Army Signal Intelligence Service, but only select individuals knew Britain had already achieved full electronic capability. This secrecy carried personal consequences for Flowers. Despite his decisive contribution, he remained a civilian engineer lacking military commission. His name appeared on no official reports circulated beyond postal authorities. Recognition requests or additional funding often met bureaucratic rejection. When Flowers submitted a £1,000 reimbursement claim for personal expenditure on the original Colossus prototype, the government denied it. He was informed no official documentation existed confirming his authorized early involvement. Still, the machine's influence reached beyond immediate intelligence applications. Colossus demonstrated that electronic logic could drive computation, a principle destined to define the computer age. Its circuits executed Boolean operations at unprecedented velocity. It implemented parallel data handling. It employed conditional testing to identify statistical patterns. These constituted foundational computing concepts years ahead of formal academic recognition. By late 1944, Colossus Mark II operated at full capacity during the Allied advance throughout Europe. German communications continued, but with mounting desperation. As networks disintegrated, intercepted Lorenz traffic began exposing chaos within the German command hierarchy. Flowers's machines continued decryption until May 1945, the month Germany capitulated. The Colossus project concluded where it originated, in secrecy. Following the war, all except 2 machines underwent dismantling. Components were salvaged as scrap. Surviving units relocated to the British Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ, where they tackled Soviet cryptanalysis during the early Cold War. Tommy Flowers returned to the Postal Research Facility. Despite constructing one of history's most significant machines, he received no public recognition, no honors, and no meaningful advancement. His contribution stayed unknown even among many colleagues. Wartime confidentiality legislation enforced silence. Outside classified channels, another narrative was forming, one largely excluding Flowers' role. In the United States, ENIAC's development in 1946 received widespread publicity as the world's inaugural electronic computer. The British, constrained by secrecy, couldn't contest that assertion. For 3 subsequent decades, Colossus remained an invisible chapter of computing history. Yet within Bletchley's preserved documentation and veteran testimonies, quiet truth endured. Without Colossus, the Lorenz cipher stays unsolved and operations fail. As post-war computing emerged, few engineers realized the foundation had already been established, not in universities or research institutes, but inside a wartime signal center by a postal engineer who trusted electronics when almost nobody else would. May 1945. Germany had surrendered. Europe's war had ended. At Bletchley Park, the machines that silently contributed to victory continued humming. For over 12 months, Colossus had intercepted, handled, and decoded supreme-level German communications. Now, identical machines were reading transmissions from emerging adversaries. The world had shifted, but signals intelligence work never stopped. For Tommy Flowers, armistice brought no celebration. His role stayed unknown, his project buried under strict classification orders. The engineers at Dollis Hill who'd built Colossus received orders to dismantle most units. Components were incinerated, manuals destroyed, and blueprints classified. The directive originated from Britain's highest government levels. The concern was that revealing the technology would expose Britain's capabilities and jeopardize post-war intelligence operations. Flowers and his team observed as years of innovation faced deliberate erasure. Only 2 colossi were preserved, transferred to the newly established Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ, at Eastcote and subsequently Cheltenham, where they continued decoding Soviet traffic during Cold War's opening phases. The secrecy was absolute. Even private discussion of the project was prohibited under the Official Secrets Act. When Flowers returned to the Postal Research Station, his wartime contribution couldn't appear on his personnel record. To most colleagues, he was simply resuming ordinary telecommunications duties. Promotions and resources went to others. In 1946, when American newspapers proclaimed the ENIAC computer as the inaugural fully electronic digital machine, Flowers knew he'd constructed something comparable and earlier, but he could articulate nothing. That silence shaped subsequent decades of his existence. Britain's scientific community advanced into computing without Colossus knowledge. Universities like Cambridge and Manchester began constructing post-war computers from foundational principles. Some engineers reinvented concepts Flowers had already validated during the war: rapid logic circuits, photoelectric tape scanning, and electronic counting mechanisms. The secrecy also warped the historical narrative. When Alan Turing's name became linked with wartime code-breaking throughout the 1950s, Flowers' work remained concealed. While Turing's bomb had addressed Enigma, Flowers' Colossus had confronted an entirely separate system, the Lorenz cipher, which was technically more sophisticated. But few outside Bletchley recognized the distinction. The first computer debate remained focused around ENIAC and subsequently Manchester's baby. The British government never amended the narrative. For Flowers, recognition might have ranked secondary to engineering advancement, but acknowledgement's absence impacted his career. He continued working at Dollis Hill on advanced telephone systems, introducing electronic switching and pulse code modulation for data transmission. Yet without visibility from his wartime innovations, he was seldom invited into academic or governmental computing conversations. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Flowers observed from distance as the computer industry expanded. Corporations like IBM, Ferranti, and Univac transformed computing into global commerce. Each press announcement claimed fresh firsts. The first programmable apparatus, the first electronic processor, the first real-time logic platform. Flowers recognized much of it as evolution from principles he'd already implemented at Bletchley. But the Colossus documentation remained sealed. It wasn't until 1970 that fragments of truth began surfacing. Wartime restrictions gradually lifted. Former codebreakers started publishing memoirs. Historians began questioning how the Allies had managed reading so many German messages so rapidly. Declassified records revealed existence of a substantial electronic decoding apparatus developed at Bletchley Park, but specifics remained vague. Flowers, now retired, was finally permitted to confirm his participation. But even then, numerous technical details stayed classified. When initial public articles mentioning Colossus appeared during the mid-1970s, they astonished computing historians. The accepted chronology of computer history required rewriting. Flowers provided interviews explaining how he'd employed 2,400 vacuum tubes in 1943 to create a programmable logic platform. His accounts were measured, factual, and aligned with the documentary evidence slowly emerging. For many, believing such an advanced computer could have existed secretly during the war proved difficult. By the time British authorities officially acknowledged Colossus in 1975, Flowers was 70 years old. Recognition arrived late and arrived quietly. There were no major honors, no national ceremonies. A limited circle of computing pioneers and historians began citing his work, particularly in Britain's postal archives. He received honorary doctorates from the University of Newcastle and subsequently London University, but little beyond. Even then, substantial portions of Colossus's design remained under security restrictions until the 1990s. The hardware had been destroyed, and only scattered engineering documentation survived. Flowers's original schematics had been lost during dismantling. Yet his recollection of the system was so accurate that he later assisted engineers in reconstructing a full-scale functional replica. In 1994, reconstruction work began on Colossus Mark II at the National Museum of Computing in Bletchley Park. The restoration depended on surviving engineer recollections and partial circuit diagrams recovered from archives. Flowers contributed his expertise and validated key design choices before his death in 1998. The replica completed during the early 2000s confirmed the precision of his assertions. When tested against intercepted Lorenz data, it functioned precisely as described, reading paper tape at thousands of symbols per second, comparing key streams, and generating statistical outputs matching wartime decryptions. The demonstration resolved decades of debate. Colossus had been genuine, functional, and operational before any other fully electronic computer in history. By then, computing's narrative had already been rewritten to incorporate Flowers's name. His work was cited alongside Turing, Newman, and Zeus. Historians concurred that while Colossus wasn't a general-purpose computer, it was the inaugural programmable electronic digital machine, the first deploying high-speed logic to resolve complex problems. For nearly 30 years, the secrecy concealing his achievement also postponed his recognition. But once facts became public, the magnitude of his accomplishment became evident. Flowers had accelerated computing by an entire generation amid a world war. Even following acknowledgement, Flowers remained humble. He characterized Colossus not as revolution, but as an engineering response to a wartime challenge. In his phrasing, it wasn't about inventing a computer. It was about obtaining results faster. The results had altered history's trajectory. But throughout most of his life, the man who constructed the world's first electronic computer couldn't even reveal it existed. Tommy Flowers died at age 92. There were no public headlines, no state tributes, and few outside computing circles grasped the depth of his contribution. For half a century, his greatest achievement had stayed classified. Only near life's end did the world begin comprehending how one engineer, working quietly inside a wartime laboratory, had propelled humanity into the electronic age. The rediscovery of Colossus during the 1990s reshaped early computing history. Declassified documentation revealed that Flowers' design preceded all post-war electronic computers, including America's ENIAC and Britain's Manchester Baby. His machine had utilized thousands of vacuum tubes for rapid logic, electronic memory buffers, and programmable configurations, concepts that would subsequently define modern computing architecture. For historians, this necessitated rewriting the accepted timeline of digital innovation. The rebuilt Colossus Mark II, completed at Bletchley Park in 2007, became physical evidence. Engineers, led by Tony Sale and supported by surviving wartime personnel, reconstructed the machine using period components and Flowers' recollections. When activated, it performed precisely as he described, reading punch tape at 5,000 symbols and automatically analyzing cipher material to identify probable Lorenz key parameters. The outcomes were measurable, repeatable, and historically verifiable. For the inaugural time, the public could witness a functioning version of the world's first electronic computer. This restoration revitalized Flowers' legacy. Academic conferences and computing publications began reassessing his influence. The Institution of Engineering and Technology honored him posthumously, citing Colossus as a milestone in both wartime innovation and information technology's birth. His name was added to educational exhibits on computing pioneers, and documentaries finally connected his work at the Postal Research Station with the technological breakthroughs that followed. Beyond historical credit, the story raised deeper questions about innovation under secrecy. Flowers' invention had emerged from necessity, not theory. Unlike subsequent computing projects driven by academic research, Colossus arose from an urgent wartime problem: the need to process information faster than any human could. Its existence proved that practical engineering, even under resource constraints, could accomplish what formal science hadn't yet envisioned. The secrecy surrounding Colossus delayed progress in British computing by several years. After the war, the government destroyed the machines and suppressed technical specifications, preventing engineers from building on Flowers' architecture. In the United States, by contrast, ENIAC's public debut spurred immediate research, funding, and commercial interest. Britain's early electronics lead was quietly lost to bureaucracy and classification. By the time Flowers' work became public, the global computer industry had already advanced. Historians subsequently argued that this silence altered British technology's trajectory. If Colossus had been declassified sooner, the foundations for digital computing could have been established in Britain rather than exported abroad. Flowers himself never voiced bitterness over this outcome. In interviews, he described the secrecy as occupational necessity and stated only that he wished others could have learned from the work earlier. Within cryptoanalysis's broader history, Flowers' contribution also marked a transition in how intelligence was collected. Before Colossus, code-breaking depended primarily on human reasoning and mathematical insight. After Colossus, it depended on machine logic, data-driven computation capable of scaling beyond human limitations. Every post-war intelligence system, from Cold War code-breaking to digital surveillance, followed the pathway he'd first demonstrated in 1943. Today, Bletchley Park's Computing Museum displays Colossus as more than an artifact. It represents the transition from mechanical to electronic thought, from wartime improvisation to digital civilization. Visitors observe the complex wiring and spinning paper tape, but few comprehend how radical it was for its era. In an age when most believed electronics were too unreliable, Tommy Flowers had trusted his experience over convention and proved an entire field wrong. Modern engineers studying Colossus note how many of its design principles still apply. The concept of separating logical operations from physical hardware, the utilization of parallel processing to increase throughput, and the practice of maintaining systems powered continuously for reliability all emerged from Flowers' wartime experiments. Even his maintenance philosophy, keeping valves warm to prevent failure, anticipated techniques employed decades later in high-availability server design. Flowers' story also became a case study in the recognition gap between scientists and engineers. While mathematicians like Turing and Tutte are celebrated for conceptual breakthroughs, Flowers exemplified applied innovation. the translation of ideas into functioning systems. Without his willingness to challenge existing assumptions, theoretical breakthroughs at Bletchley might have remained academic exercises. By the early 21st century, Flowers' name had begun appearing in textbooks, exhibitions, and national honors lists. The Royal Mail issued a commemorative stamp in his memory featuring Colossus circuitry. Bletchley Park's archives officially credited him as chief designer and builder of the world's first electronic programmable computer. Several computing awards now bear his name. Yet the essence of his contribution remains straightforward. He employed engineering to solve an impossible problem. In 1943, with limited resources and no precedent, he constructed a machine that could process data at electronic speed and alter the course of a global war. Colossus didn't win battles directly. It provided knowledge. Knowledge that helped shorten the war, save lives, and shape modern intelligence. In that sense, its creator transformed warfare without ever holding a weapon. Today, when digital systems govern everything from communication to defense, the principles behind them trace back to that wartime laboratory at WWII, and to the engineer who proved that electronics could think. Tommy Flowers' legacy isn't just that he built the first electronic computer. It's that he showed what happens when practical minds challenge accepted limits. His invention was hidden for decades, but its influence became permanent. The digital age began quietly with wires, valves, and conviction. And it began with him. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to WWII Rewind for more untold stories from the shadows of history. Because sometimes the greatest victories are the ones nobody ever sees.